Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. Episode 143, The Stonemason. Daniel Herbert, a master stonemason, was a convict who was sent out to Van Dieman's Land. He earned his freedom through his work on the Ross Bridge. Daniel Herbert was baptised at Taunton Deane, Somersetshire, on the 2nd of February 1802. He was the fourth child of Daniel Herbert and Mary Rogers, who had married in Liverpool in 1790. His father, Daniel Herbert, was a corporal in the 6th Inniskillen Dragoons, having enlisted in May 1793 in Leeds. The regiment was garrisoned in Exeter during the bread riots in which the poor rebelled against the farmers, the merchants and the gentry, and the insatiable navy, all of those who contributed to the rising cost of flour and the starvation of the poverty-stricken and underemployed. It seems that Mary was a camp follower, a most miserable existence for a pregnant mother of toddlers. In 1802, the regiment was in Nottingham, where there was a smell of revolution amongst the low folk, before it moved to Birmingham, where Corporal Daniel Herbert died on the 29th of May 1803. And this was when Daniel Jr. was only a little over a year old. His father had been a member of the Freemasons' Lodge attached to the regiment. Perhaps Mary received a small tribute from her brother Masons after her husband's death, enabling her to return to her family in Lancashire. Mary Herbert married a Thomas Bulmer when Daniel was 15 in Eccles, Manchester. Daniel Jr. lived with his uncle, John Rogers of Ancoats, a master stonemason who took him on as an apprentice signboard writer and stonemason. When he was 17, he committed his first crime in Manchester. He robbed John Tanfield, a leather thread maker, and was sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment in Leeds Castle. Within weeks of his release, he robbed Ellen Benson of 2 blankets. He was then committed to 7 years' transportation. He spent 4 years in the Hulk Retribution at Sheerness at the mouth of the Thames, and he was probably sent to work on the wharf as a stonemason at this time. He was released after 4 years and 2 months' jail, and 1 in 300 men were recommended for royal clemency for good behaviour. However, in September, he committed the first of 4 acts of highway robbery. With James Campbell and John Lynch, they waited for unsuspected travellers to walk by, mugged them, stole their money, pocketbooks and anything they thought useful, and then left the stunned men by the wayside. On the way back, they would stop in at inns to buy bread, cheese, gin or ale, and they were apprehended near Upper Mill by 2 men and delivered to the York Castle dungeons on the night of October 23, 1827. Daniel was charged before the North Eastern Circuit Assizes with 4 counts of highway robbery and putting people in bodily fear and danger. He'd already been convicted of breaking into a home and stealing, and when he and his accomplices pleaded guilty, they were sentenced to death. That was changed for a life term in Australia. He was believed to have said, "All I longed for was peace of death, but they wouldn't even grant me that," when he received news he was being transported to Van Dieman's Land. Daniel was delivered to the Hulk, Leviathan, at Portsmouth on the 12th of April, where he remained working on shore until the August, when he was transferred to the convict ship Asia that arrived at Sullivan's Cove, Van Dieman's Land, on the 7th of December 1827. His occupation on his convict record was marked as a stonemason. He was placed in the public works and lodged in the prisoners' barracks and was permitted to work for himself on Saturday afternoons. He found work with Isaac Chapman, an enterprising Methodist who was a cabinet maker, carpenter, builder and undertaker. Daniel's first appearance before the Principal Superintendent of Convicts was at the behest of Mr. Chapman in June 1828. The accusation was that he was not performing his work according to the agreement that he had with Chapman. He was ordered to finish the job as agreed. Isaac Chapman was also in charge of public works at the Government Gardens, which is now the Royal Tasmanian Botanical Gardens, in 1828, where a director's cottage and hothouse was being built from sandstone quarried on the site. In 1833, Daniel was commissioned by William Davidson, the director of the Government Gardens, to carve the pedestal of a sundial that was to be a gift for William Davidson's wife Elizabeth, and to carve a mantelpiece for his private cottage in Elberton Street. The figures are quaint, naive, but accomplished with details of artichokes and flowers on the mantelpiece. As a stonemason, he was placed in the engineers department and for the next 7 years was employed on government projects in Hobart, including the new female factory at Cascade. Between 1828 and 1833, Daniel was absent from nighttime muster or away from barracks all night. Sometimes he was reprimanded and sometimes he was sentenced to the treadwheel, 3 days, 7 days and then 3 days. When he was arrested at Devine's public house after hours, he was given 10 days on the treadmill with the added insult of working in irons for a month. The next time he was absent at night, he lost his right to work on 3 consecutive Saturday afternoons. After that, for being absent from his labour and from muster in the prisoner barracks at night, he was flogged 25 lashes. Even after that, he absented himself 3 times from his duty of barrack muster. On Friday the 25th, 1831, he did not go to work in the morning. 3 other masons and 2 skilled quarrymen were absent from their labour at the New Orphan School on that day too. Daniel Herbert received 1 month's jail in Hobart Town as a result. Daniel was assigned then to the engineers department and made frequent appearances before the magistrate for unapproved work absences and drunkenness. By 1835, he was employed as an overseer of stonemasons on the construction of the new Customs House in Hobart, which is Tasmania's Parliament House today, a service for which he was paid 1 shilling a day. Following various misdemeanours, he gained a little respect as the overseer at the building. Meanwhile at Ross, a plan had been put in place to build a new bridge. The convict masons had been occupied quarrying and facing stones for months and years, yet the bridge did not grow. What did grow, however, were the houses of the local gentry and the village of Ross. George Arthur sent in a special constable, Jorgen Jorgensen, with a team of men to clean up the town. This still did not work, and the bridge was only completed when Josiah Spode, principal superintendent of convicts, was asked to recommend 2 stonemasons to be transferred to Ross and oversee the completion of a replacement bridge across the Macquarie River. The bridge was designed by John Lee Archer, and Daniel and James Colbeck, another convict stonemason, were the 2 recommended and chosen for the job. Before Daniel travelled to Ross, he sought permission to marry fellow convict Mary Witherington, and they married at Ross on the 1st of July 1835. The Ross Bridge was nominated by Engineering Heritage Tasmania as a national landmark, largely because of the ornate carvings that Herbert created. From a distance, it's a rather unassuming small bridge made of 3 arches that stretch across the river, but it's a different story up close. The bridge contains 186 keystones or vossiers carved by Herbert, all completed under his supervision in 56 weeks between May 1835 and July 1836. He was promised a conditional pardon for successfully completing the task. The archer stones were carved with a series of Celtic designs and caricatures, most likely of people whom Herbert knew. Historians have combed over other areas of 17th and 18th century architecture to find anything else in the world like them, but to no avail. Also odd is the complete lack of correspondence when it came to approvals for the carvings. According to all of the official literature and documentation, they were just building a bridge. Even the overseers' journals and inspectors' reports say nothing of the carvings, which are on every stone in the arch. Carving the keystone might have been more typical, but Herbert's work on Ross Bridge still stands out as one of the finest examples of convict labour and art from the era. Daniel embellished the bridge with interesting and satirical carvings. It was likely that the carvings were an outburst of subversion, an unspoken expression of displeasure towards an unfair society, the cruelty of the British colonial penal system, and perhaps even Calvinist Christianity, which numerous of the bridge's Celtic symbols seem to be mocking. Herbert learnt his trade in Somerset, a centre of Celtic culture in ancient Britain. As he learnt stonemasonry, he would have become familiar with Celtic imagery and religious beliefs that had become part of the masons' code and were often expressed in the ornate stonework they created. Ross Bridge was possibly his chance to shout back at the world, but in such a way that would not invoke more punishment, pain and misery from his oppressors. Many are not directly representational, but give impressions of rural activity with wool bales and wheat sheaves. On the keystones and elsewhere also are depictions of animal and human figures. Celtic-derived carvings are interspersed with small icons believed to be of persons living at the time. There are various interpretations of Daniel's curious carved motifs, including claims that the many carved heads were portraits of Daniel and his wife, a figure depicted with a crown that was said to be the eccentric Norwegian or Danish convict, explorer, British spy, and one-time King of Iceland, Jorgen Jorgensen, which I have done a bonus episode on, and Lieutenant Governor Sir George Arthur, which I've also done a bonus episode on. The faces that Daniel Herbert had were all people that he was acquainted with, people he befriended, fellow prisoners, and people who were patrons. Such carvings were not normally included on stone bridges of that era, and by rights they should not exist. As a consequence, the Ross Bridge is unique in the world as the only bridge to have such carvings. Herbert must have gained prior permission from Captain Turner to sculpt these stones, and this permission must have been granted, at least verbally. Captain Turner, however, did not officially inform anyone of his decision. John Lee Archer must have seen this work in progress during one of his site visits, yet his diary appears silent on the subject. The same applies to Roderick O'Connor, the Inspector of Works. Sculpting these stones could not have been done in secret. The bridge was completed in July 1836 with every stone laid by hand, and it's the third oldest and one of Australia's finest sandstone bridges. The bridge is on the National Heritage Registry and was registered in 1978. A plaque was unveiled in 1986 on the 150th anniversary year of the opening of the bridge. Daniel Herbert was granted a free pardon in February 1842 and continued living at Ross, where he worked as an ornamental stonemason and farmed. He was credited with carving a number of motifs on other buildings in Tasmania, including St Luke's Presbyterian Church at Bothwell. He carried out a number of building works privately through the Midlands and carved a number of gravestones that are in the old Ross burial ground today. Daniel Herbert died of bronchitis on the 28th of February 1868 at Campbelltown, aged 67. His wife Mary was to survive him by 22 years. There is a Herbert family tomb. It was not made primarily by Daniel Herbert for himself. It came through a loss he and his wife Mary felt deeply, the loss of their 27-month-old son Henry Ernest, who was born on the 3rd of June 1846. This is all inscribed on the top of the stone table that Daniel made himself. The urn is a lovely touch, and the hills behind this scene, you can just make out the old quarries which most of the stone used in the building of the bridge was extracted. A 1.3 metre sandstone statue from about 1836, satirising Governor George Arthur, is believed to have been carved by Daniel Herbert due to the style matching that of the bridge carvings. It was donated to Tasmania's Maritime Museum in 2023. Arthur is standing, holding his penis as a statue with plumbing arrangements thought to be part of a fountain, which would have had Arthur urinating all over the people of the colony. Researchers concluded that the benefactor who would have most likely commissioned the work was William Commode, a wealthy Tasmanian maritime merchant and Midlands landowner. Commode had a motive. The pair clashed over land ownership and the use of convict labour. So deep and public was Commode's animosity that he petitioned London to have the governor recalled. And when Her Majesty obliged in June 1836, the landowner announced in the true colonist Van Dieman's Land Political Dispatch that he would gift land at Hobart's Battery Point for the erection of a substantial public memorial of the joy of the colonists at the recall of Colonel Arthur. Given the depth of ill feeling between Commode and Arthur, it is feasible to consider that Commode might have commissioned a functioning statue of Governor Arthur urinating over the people of the colony. He had ready access to the most accomplished stonemasons of the day. The Tasmanian Wool Centre Museum has a set-in-stone sculpture competition and exhibition that aims to celebrate traditional techniques and forms. The competition is in honour of Daniel Herbert in the spirit of his work. The artists can only use hand tools to create their works. Norman Laird wrote a book, Ross Bridge and the Sculpture of Daniel Herbert in 1971, and it provides a wonderful assessment of Daniel Herbert with these words. He was harshly treated, no amount of glazing can hide it. He suffered the most severe of beatings and bruises for incredibly slight breaches of the regulations. For most convicts, life was a long, tedious, grey and featureless life of misery, fear and pain, so that not a few death may have often appeared preferable. For Daniel, there was a complete loss of status, of common understanding and common sacrifice. These crippling losses wounded him deeply. Even so, there was an iron will at work which was beyond the power of those to break, whether he was shuffling along in a chain gang, tied to a triangle, or fatigued beyond reason at the treadmill. But with every clank of the chain, with every slash of the whip, there aroused in him a fragment of an archaic memory that was later used into dynamic energy. Little did his persecutors realise that he had set in motion in the silent man from Somerset a force that would haunt their ghosts forever. After all that he said in his bridge art, Herbert was said to be a quiet and gentle man. And a little on Daniel's wife, Mary Witherington. Mary was born Mary Osbaldeston Witherington, and she was born in Handley, Dorset, England on the 22nd of June 1806. She was the daughter of Henry Withington and Rebecca Osbaldeston, who'd married in 1802. She was the oldest of 4 children. Mary was tried at Middlesex on the 8th of July 1828 for larceny. Her age is listed as 28 in these court records. However, her convict records state her correct age as 23. She had stolen from her mistress, Mrs. Stanley of Convent Garden, where she was working as a housemaid and cook. The Old Bailey proceedings in July 1828 on the trial of Mary outlined that she was indicted for stealing on the 4th of June 3 spoons, 4 blankets, 2 tablecloths, 5 sheets, 1 counterpane, 1 bolster, 3 pillows and 1 table cover, the goods of Anne Stanley, widow, her mistress. Anne Stanley stated that she was a widow and the prisoner was in her service for 8 months. She'd missed all these articles from my house and saw them at the office. James Sayers, a pawnbroker, said he had 3 spoons pawned by the prisoner at different times in January and May. Julius Hockley, a pawnbroker, said he had some blankets and other articles pawned by the prisoner. William Corbell, a pawnbroker, said he had 2 sheets and a tablecloth pawned by the prisoner in May and June. William Marchant, a pawnbroker, said he had some articles pawned by the prisoner between December and May. John Birchall said he was an officer and he took the prisoner and he found duplicates of the goods in the house and some in a teacup in her bedroom. Francis Fagan said he took the prisoner and on her person found 2 duplicates of items which related to this property. Christopher John Stanley said, I am the son-in-law of the prosecutrix. I found 2 duplicates in the prison's bedroom. The property produced was sworn to and she was found guilty and transported for 14 years. She arrived on the Harmony on the 13th of September 1828 from England. She had suffered from enteritis, so gastro, and pneumonia on the voyage, and she arrived in Hobart on the 14th of January 1829. In October 1829, she was twice charged with suspicion of petty theft from her master, Mr. Griffiths, and was given 1 month in the House of Corrections for each offence. On the 11th of January 1832, she was assigned to Dr. Scott and disobeyed her mistress's orders by admitting a man to the home and making him tea. She was jailed with bread and water for 14 days and placed in crime class for this offence at the Female Cascades factory. After her marriage, Mary was given a ticket of leave in September 1836. She applied for her conditional pardon in July 1838 and it was granted in July 1840. She was freed by servitude in July 1842 and received her certificate of freedom on the 12th of October 1852. Mary died at the Launceston Invalid Depot on the 17th of June 1890 at the age of 83. She was an invalid and died of senility. His children, Sarah and Sophia Herbert, was born at Ross on the 4th of September 1839. She married John Francis Tucker on the 20th of June 1863 in Campbelltown. And the wedding announcement states, on the 20th of July 1863, Daniel Herbert attended the wedding of his daughter, Sarah Ann Sophia Herbert, to Francis John Tucker at Campbelltown, Tasmania. The certificate of marriage was at his place of residence in Ross. Sarah and John had 10 children, and Sarah died at Cressy, Tasmania, on the 16th of July 1918 at the age of 88. Their second child, Frederick Stewart Herbert, was born on the 21st of November 1842 in Ross. He married Brenda Northwood on the 25th of April 1862 at Campbelltown, Tasmania, when he was 19 and Brenda 16. Brenda had been born in England and was 7 when she came out to Australia with her family in September 1853. By 1854, the family were living in Sydney. And the marriage notice says, at Ross, by Reverend J. Cope, Wesleyan minister, Frederick Stewart, only son of Daniel Herbert, to Miss Brenda Northwood. They had 2 children together, a boy and a girl, in 1863 and 1864. However, in 1865, at Ross, it says, Adam Jackson Esquire, for the arrest of Brenda Herbert, charged with stealing a wooden box painted stone colour with an umber border and 1 gold brooch, the property of Daniel Herbert. And then on the 16th of March 1867, it says, regarding Daniel Herbert of Ross, stonemason, an insolvency was examined by Mr. Douglas. Mr. Herbert said, I was employed as a stonemason at Mr. Commode's from the beginning of the year 1865 to June of 1865 at £2 per week wages. I was paying £35 a year for rent. I did not deal with Mr. Brickhill, but it has been proved that my wife did. I provided my wife with the money after payment of rent, and she had the benefits arising from the pound. I am a pound keeper. I was generally from 3 to 4 months at a time at Mr. Commode's. My son is 24 years of age, and he's married and has a wife and 2 children, but she absconded from him. My wife is sextoness of the church, and I was the organist for a time. I gave up the premises in December. I paid Mr. Cleve the last 3 years' rent up. The £65 for rent was due prior to 1864. I was to work for it, but he never asked me. I am prepared to work it out. Mary Herbert was examined. I am the wife of Daniel Herbert. I was in the habit of dealing at Mr. Bricknell's shop for years before he died, and since with my successors. My husband was not aware of my dealing at Brickhill's. He never asked me where I got my groceries or dresses. In 5 months I obtained goods to the amount of £45. 1 pair of trousers I gave to my husband. The other 2 pairs were for my son. My husband did not inquire where I bought the trousers. He was at work at Mr. Commode's and only came home occasionally. I was earning £40 a year as a laundress for some time. I had my son and his wife and family to support. He worked when he could get work, but he is an invalid and spits blood whenever he does work. He has an allotment of land at Ross. It was purchased for him when quite a lad in his own name, Frederick Stewart Herbert. He has been quarrying stone for a house which is partly built on the allotment. There is not a single room finished in it. I don't know the value of it. The insolvent applied for his discharge, and they made an adjournment to enable for more investigations. So it mentioned that Brenda absconded. Well, she seemed to emigrate to Victoria, and she married John Lancaster Lockwood in Echuca on the 10th of February 1872. He was English and 35 when they married. Brenda was 26. There were no children from this marriage. John had emigrated to Tasmania from England in March 1855 when he was 17 with his parents. John Lockwood then married Sarah Johanna Gibson in Beaconsfield, Tasmania in August 1882, and they had 2 children. John Lockwood died in Tasmania in 1897. And it's said that John Lockwood for the past 3 years had carried on a small business in Rook Street, West Devonport. He died suddenly and he'd been in failing health for some time of a liver complaint. The deceased was born in Yorkshire in 1837, arrived in Tasmania in 1855 and was closely identified with mining. In 1870 he visited the Victorian, New South Wales and New Zealand goldfields in succession and then returned to Tasmania and was among the first to open up mines at Beaconsfield. He resided at the latter place until 3 years ago. He leaves a widow and 1 son. His parents are still residing in Beaconsfield. Brenda died in Sydney in 1926 under the name Brenda Elliott. There was a Brenda Elliott listed in the 1903 and 1904 census living in Randwick and working as a confectioner, and records indicated that she was living in Sydney as Brenda Elliott as early as 1898. Frederick Herbert married Agnes Stevenson when he was 45 and Agnes 37 at Launceston. He listed his occupation as a builder and a bachelor, but Brenda did not die until 1926. Frederick and Agnes had 12 children, including triplets, from 1870 to 1885, all before their marriage. Only 2 survived infancy. On the 11th of February 1888, it says Frederick Stewart Herbert, on a charge of leaving his wife and 4 children without means of support, was remanded until Friday. And then a follow-up 4 days later said a case against Frederick Stewart Herbert for deserting his wife and children was dismissed at the request of his wife, the complainant. Frederick Herbert died in Queensland on the 3rd of September 1916 at the age of 73. The third child, Ernest Henry Herbert, that was mentioned before, he was born on the 23rd of November 1845 in Campbelltown, Tasmania, and he died on the 3rd of June 1846. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.